Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Excuse me. It's been a couple of weeks since I've done one of these video game collector videos, collector's guides, and to be honest, I'm kind of running out of game consoles to talk about that I have any knowledge of collecting, but we're going to talk about the Dreamcast. And I'm going to piss people off because I have tremendous issues with the Dreamcast. Not just the design, the games, the marketing, and everything that Sega did with it, and all the fuck-ups they made. Those are all issues I have with it. But also this weird revisionist history where 6 million people bought a Dreamcast in 1999, and 40 million people online act like they all had a Dreamcast in 1999, and they goddamn didn't. So, it irritates me. And I'm not one of those, like, this isn't going to be one of those, like, shitting on people that like the Dreamcast. If you like it, great, good for you. If you don't, I'm going to give you reasons why, or at least what you need to know about, before you jump in head first. And I'm going to give it to you straight. I'm not a fangirl. I love Sega. Don't get me wrong. You know this. I talk up Sega consoles. One of my favorite game consoles of all time is the Genesis. Some of my favorite games of all time are Sega games. The Dreamcast didn't do it for me. But we're not here to talk about everything that went wrong with the Genesis or the Dreamcast. I've already done that in other videos. I'm just here to give you information on, do you want to collect the Dreamcast? Okay, question I have first, why? And if you don't have an answer but you want to anyways, or you have an answer and I'm like, okay, fine, here's everything you need to know. The first thing you need to know is the Dreamcast actually sold worse in some ways than the Saturn. It did better than the Saturn in the US, but worse than the Saturn overall and in Japan. So believe it or not, everybody talks about how rare Saturn games are and how expensive Saturn is. Nobody ever talks about the Dreamcast because I don't understand. But the Dreamcast is almost as rare as the Saturn, hardware-wise. Now, software, it did a little bit better for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons it did better is because it was easier to develop for the Dreamcast, and part of this was they partnered with Microsoft to bring a specific version of Windows to the Dreamcast to make it easier to port games from Windows DirectX environment over to the Dreamcast, and to make games for the Dreamcast and port them to Windows. To make it easier to get software for the system, because the Saturn was notoriously difficult to develop games for. So where there were roughly plus or minus 10 to 15, around 250 US released Saturn games, and quite a few of those were re-releases or remixes or things like that, or even a couple of compilations to kind of pad the lineup. The Dreamcast had closer to 300 titles, so roughly as many software titles, give or take, as the Nintendo 64 in the US. Slightly more in Japan. I don't know what they had in Europe, or if it even had a presence in Europe. I don't know. Sega tended to do better in Europe and America than they ever did in Japan. The Saturn being the biggest exception, where the Saturn did relatively well in Japan and flopped everywhere else. So the first thing you need to know about the Dreamcast is hardware is going to be difficult to come across. And it might be more expensive than you realize, because they didn't sell as well as people think it did, because they lump it in with the PS2, GameCube, Xbox generation, which it isn't. It's actually the N64 Dreamcast. They're in their own generation. The N64 is more powerful than the PlayStation and Saturn, and came a year later, 2 years later actually, and the Dreamcast came a couple of years after the N64, and isn't as powerful as the PS2, GameCube, or Xbox. So it's really a mid-generation refresh kind of thing, like the Wii U. But for whatever reason, people like to lump it in with the PS2, GameCube, Xbox generation. I do not agree with that, but I'm not going to tell you what to do, just whatever. But from a logistics standpoint, and for like everything else, yeah, it is technically the successor to the Saturn, but it's not on par with the PS2 or the GameCube or the Xbox. And so a lot of people go into the Dreamcast because a lot of the Dreamcast games, especially the more popular titles or the more marketable titles, were ported over to the Xbox, PS2, and GameCube. Although a lot of times they were enhanced for those hardware systems because they were more powerful systems. They go into the Dreamcast expecting PS2 level of graphics, and a lot of times they get disappointed because they realize it's not on par with the PS2, which was the weakest of those three primary consoles. Which is why I don't like to lump the Dreamcast in there, because just from like if you go down and just go down the check marks, this, and this, it is not on the same level of the PS2 and the GameCube and the Xbox. It's basically a slightly more powerful N64 with a CD-ROM drive, or a GD-ROM drive. We'll have to talk about that in a minute. And it's got more in common with the N64 in terms of graphics and capabilities. It's like if they took an N64 and a Sony PlayStation and smooshed them together. That's essentially what the Dreamcast is in terms of capabilities. So a lot of people go into it expecting it to be better than it is, because a lot of the launch titles, the first year of the Dreamcast, because it was only on the market for like 3.5 years before it was kaput, look more like PlayStation 1 or N64 titles than they do actually next-gen titles. They might have better, a little bit more textures. They might have better looking pre-rendered backgrounds and some FMVs and things and a higher polygon count. But a lot of them don't look as next-gen as you think they do. And that does surprise a lot of people that here on the internet people lump it in with those other two systems. Case in point, Sonic Adventure. Now, Sonic Adventure does not look that much better. Sonic Adventure DX on the GameCube does not look that much better than Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast. It's slightly enhanced. Sort of like how Dragon Ball Z Budokai on the GameCube is slightly enhanced over the PS2 version. It's noticeable if you go frame by frame, shot by shot, side by side. But if you're just playing it, you're not going to be able to recall. It's kind of like the differences between the SNES and the Genesis. If you go frame by frame, side by side, yeah, you can spot the differences. But otherwise, you're going to be like, you know what, they look almost the same. Close enough. It's kind of like that. But then you look at later Sonic games from that era, like Sonic Heroes or Shadow the Hedgehog, and you're like, oh no, these are next-gen level Sonic games. Sonic Adventure is just a prettier, slightly more polished N64 game, more or less. So you have to go into it with your expectations around here. Because if you're expecting it to be up here, you're going to be disappointed. The second thing people need to know about the Dreamcast is I mentioned the GD-ROM. This thing is weird because it does not use CD-ROM and it does not use DVD-ROM. Now, I don't know all of the technical bits and bobs of what makes a GD-ROM different from a CD-ROM or a DVD-ROM. All I know, two things that you need to know. Number one, it's a higher capacity disc than a CD, but a smaller capacity disc than a DVD. It's about 1 gigabyte. So it's even though it's a full-size disc, it can't even hold as much information, as much data, as a GameCube mini disc could, which was about 1.5 gigabytes, plus or minus. So it's not really... So you're going to have a lot of multi-disc games on the Dreamcast, and you're going into it thinking it's again, next gen, right? PS2, Xbox, GameCube. You're going to be surprised. You're like, wait a minute, why does this game have 3 discs? I thought this was next gen. Well, that's why. The second thing you need to know about the GD-ROM is there's no copy protection. So just like with the Saturn and the Sega CD, you could download, theoretically, disc images, CD-ROM images of Dreamcast titles, burn them directly to an actual CD-ROM disc. You don't need a special disc, just a little compression. and you're good to go. And they will play natively in a stock Dreamcast without any modification. Now, because the Dreamcast is a CD-ROM based system, just like the PlayStation and the Saturn, and because it has its own proprietary BIOS, and it has a proprietary version of Windows, you do not have any legal retro clones. Now, there might be somebody out there in the aftermarket selling you, in the black market, selling you something that theoretically could play Dreamcast software. I highly advise do not buy that. So there aren't any current viable options in terms of aftermarket compatible Dreamcast stuff. You're not going to be able to get a retro clone or some type of FPGA type system, because you would be breaking the law by including the copyrighted version of Windows and the copyrighted BIOS. So that's a no-no. So it's not as easy to retro clone as a console, a cartridge console, because of that. So now let's talk about emulation. Dreamcast, the motherboard, the internal guts of the Dreamcast, and again, this is not exact, but it's close enough, are more or less the same as the Sega Naomi arcade board. The board that was used in Virtua Fighter 3 and House of the Dead 2, I believe, are the two big games that use that board. There were other games, but you've never heard of them because they were games that were left in the arcade. So, again, Sega was still an arcade business at the time, so their philosophy was make games for the arcade and then bring them to the home console. That didn't work out so good on the Saturn and Dreamcast like it did on the Genesis, so Sega was kind of late to get the memo, hey, people don't want that anymore. Now they want story-driven, open world type games with bigger worlds to explore and stuff that we would get a ton of in the PS2 era that we really didn't get on the Dreamcast, which is another reason why the Dreamcast doesn't really feel like it's on par with the PS2, the Xbox, and the GameCube, because the game design still feels more arcadey and 90s than it does in those other three consoles. So there are you have Shenmue 2, and then you have a handful of about 5 or 6, and that's it. Really big, I'm not going to say open world, but big 3D worlds to explore with, story-driven, pre-rendered graphics, FMVs, kind of like that next-gen vibe. Everything else feels like a PlayStation game. You got Resident Evil. Well, that's a PlayStation game. Nightmare Creatures. That's a PlayStation game. Grand Theft Auto 2. That's a PlayStation game. You know what I'm saying? So even the Tony Hawk's on the Dreamcast really doesn't look that much better than the N64 version. Again, unless you're going side by side, frame by frame, level by level, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, you can go oh yeah, it's got more, I guess, detail in the environments or something. But it's in real world, sit down and play, you're not going to notice. You're really not. So, and the controller, we have to talk about that obnoxious, god-awful controller. For one, it's comparable to this in that it's got the 4 face buttons. It's got the D-pad in the wrong spot, the joystick in the wrong spot, 1 joystick, not 2, the shoulder buttons, it's got a big hole in the middle, but this is down here in the ass instead of up here where it belongs. So that's obnoxious. And it's got a big hole in the middle of it, right in the middle of it, where you can plug in your stupid VMU unit that was only used in a handful of games, and none of them require it, and you can get by without it. So there's that. But if you really want to get into collecting for the Dreamcast, there are a handful of revisions. Some of them are more expensive than others. And I do not know if it's region locked or not, but there's a little bit more software in the Japan region than there is in the North American region. And I don't know if it even existed in Europe or not. But I can't imagine it would have done all that well in Europe because PlayStation was kicking ass in Europe. Even Nintendo was struggling in that generation in Europe. So I'm going to guess probably not. Maybe it did exist, but it probably didn't have a ton of exclusives. But I'm coming at it from a North American perspective anyway, specifically USA, so that's what I'm going to talk about. If I lived in Japan, I would be telling you how to collect Japanese consoles, but I don't, so I won't. Now, I'm not trying to say there are no fun games on the Dreamcast, because there are. I'm just telling you to have your when you buy a Saturn, your first thing that you're thinking, because it's a Sega console, it's a 32-bit, CD-ROM based, in your head you're like, oh yeah, this is going to be like, like Dreamcast, right? You're thinking like Sonic Adventure or whatever. Then you play it and you're like, this is PlayStation quality, like PS1 quality, and you hear bullshit on the internet that the Saturn was more powerful than the PlayStation, but it was too hard to program for. No, it wasn't. Actually, the PlayStation was more powerful than the Saturn. The Saturn did things differently than the PlayStation, and that's where people get confused. But the second part is true. It was more difficult to develop for, and because the sales were bupkis, nobody made games for the Saturn, or if they did, they didn't put any effort into it. But you're going to find out that a lot of your exclusive games for the Saturn aren't all that great, and your third-party games you're going to find better 90% of the time. There are a couple of exceptions. 90% of the time, the PlayStation version is better. Now, even though the Dreamcast is the successor to the Saturn, and by extension, next level of technology than the N64 and the Sony PlayStation, roughly 45 or so % of its software library are just PlayStation games. And then another 25% of them are games that couldn't run on the PlayStation very easily due to, the N64 being more powerful. So they're N64 games. And then there's, the rest, and I don't know the exact percentages, but the rest are Sega games and a handful of third-party exclusives. Not enough to really justify going out of your way to collect for the Saturn or the Dreamcast. But let's say you want it for you're a completist, or you love Sega, or you're just fascinated by that generation, or you already have all 4,000 PS2 games and all 800 Xbox and 600 or 700 GameCube games, and you want more. First of all, are you rich? All right, good for you. But if you need the 300 or so Dreamcast games, well, I got some bad news for you. A good percentage of them aren't going to be that much better, not significantly better than their PlayStation 1 or N64 counterparts. So you're going to be overpaying, again, just like you would on the Saturn, where you're overpaying for a game that is essentially more or less identical to the PlayStation version. You're doing that again on the Dreamcast. Again, there are some exceptions, but those games are expensive because they're rare, just like they are on the Saturn, because they didn't sell well. Because nobody knows what Power Stone is. Nobody's ever heard of it. You're going to be told it's the best game on the Dreamcast, and then you're going to look up the price tag, and you're going to be like, nope, get the fuck out of here. I ain't got that kind of money. So, the Dreamcast, like the N64 and the subsequent generation, sans the PS2, so we're talking Xbox and GameCube, does have the 4 controller ports. So that is where a lot of people lump it in with the next gen, because it's like, yeah, okay. That's why I call it a mid-gen. PS1 and Saturn are their own generation. N64 is the next generation, but people lump it in for whatever reason. And then the Dreamcast is in between those two, and then you have PS2, Xbox, GameCube. But you do what you do. You do you. I don't give a fuck. You call it what you want. I don't give a fuck. I'm just, not going to agree with you. I'm not going to argue with you, but I'm not going to agree with you. But you do have to know that there are not a significant number of quality, exclusive 4-player games on the Dreamcast that you can't get on other systems, like the N64 or the GameCube or the Xbox. So be warned there. Again, the obvious exception is Power Stone, which is the game everybody's going to try to push you into buying. That's like trying to buy Crystal Chronicles for the GameCube. Good fucking luck. You know what I'm saying? You better have a fucking platinum card in your fucking wallet if you want to collect for the Dreamcast. if you want to get the good games. Otherwise, you're going to find out it's a bunch of sports games, arcade racers, and a shit ton of games that are like, almost identical to their PlayStation 1 and N64 counterparts. And you're going to be like, this was fucking next gen? Are you goddamn kidding me? Or you're going to get a handful of exclusives like that Frogger or Echo the Dolphin or fucking Prince of Persia that are just like disgustingly awful. That you're going to be like, oh my god, what the fuck is this? So, you're only going to end up with, just like with the N64 and maybe even the Saturn, you're really realistically only going to end up with about 50 or so legit, quality, worthwhile exclusives on the Dreamcast that you're going to want to focus on. Everything else, are you really going to go out of your way to get NFL fucking 2K1 on the Dreamcast when you can get the exact same game on the PS2 or the Xbox or the GameCube for like a nickel? Are you fucking kidding me? Use your noggin. God gave you a brain, use it. Okay? Now, who's it for? Whose brain is so broken that they would want to own a Dreamcast? Well, like I said, completists, obviously. If you have to have everything, well, this is something. Sega nerds are going to probably want a Dreamcast, especially if you have an emotional connection to Sega themselves. And anyone that found the N64 desirable, if you loved what was on the N64, you're probably going to enjoy what was on the Dreamcast because it's almost the same shit. Even if it is prettier graphics, gameplay-wise, it's not any more advanced. So you haven't got to GameCube PS2 level of advanced yet. You're still operating in the arcade-style graphics and gameplay. They're going to trick you with like their flashy graphics and the higher polygon counts and their FMVs and pre-rendered backgrounds and things and flashier texture mapping and lighting effects and things. So it's going to look a little bit better than a PS1 or an N64, but not so much better that it's worth the extra price or investing in another system. And gameplay-wise, you know, Grand Theft Auto 2 is a very 90s PC game. Grand Theft Auto 3 on the PS2 is legit next-gen. Grand Theft Auto 2 is just Grand Theft Auto 2. You got Grand Theft Auto, then you got Grand Theft Auto 2. We sweep those games under the rug. They're just like historical significance, move the fuck on. Grand Theft Auto 3 is the first legit entry in the franchise. Grand Theft Auto 3, from a technological standpoint, cannot, it is impossible to run Grand Theft Auto 3 on the Dreamcast. It does not have the physical hardware capabilities to play that game. It cannot. It does not have the polygon rendering. It does not have the lighting. It does not have the storage space on the disc. It doesn't have the RAM. It doesn't have the graphics capabilities and the GPU. It can't. It cannot do Grand Theft Auto 3. So you're stuck with these this in between PS1, PS2, which is more or less like N64 with a CD-ROM. It's essentially what the N64 would have been had Nintendo just put a CD-ROM in it and given it the proper texture cache that it should have had. And then that's essentially what you got. So again, a lot of people like to imagine, what would the N64 had been like if it had a CD-ROM? The Dreamcast. That's exactly what it would have looked like. Little bit better, prettier, flashier than what we got, but not like eye-popping next-gen. Now, when the Dreamcast launched, it was eye-popping next-gen because they tricked you with the sports games, again, higher polygon counts, and some of the games like, Soul Calibur or Mortal Kombat Gold, which was an enhanced version of Mortal Kombat 4, but again, it's really just Mortal Kombat 4 with more characters. It's like the ultimate MK3 version of Mortal Kombat 4 is essentially all it is. But in terms of actual gameplay, it's the same fucking game. It doesn't look any better at all, really. Not significantly better. Better, yeah, noticeably better, but not significantly better. So, what are your options outside of spending an exorbitant amount of money on physical, maybe working hardware, which, good luck, and then spending an exorbitant amount of money on software, or, downloading them and pirating them. Oops, I said that out loud. Well, there's emulation. There's two things you need to know about Dreamcast emulation. One, it's not done very well. There are no legit, functional, quality Dreamcast emulators. Most of the Dreamcast emulators can't run shit. And if they can't run it worth a shit. And two, there's not a lot of Dreamcast games outside of like Sonic Adventure that have been brought forward to new generations, whether it's, Xbox Live or PlayStation In or Game Pass or whatever. There's not a lot of life in the Dreamcast, afterlife in the Dreamcast software library. I would say a good 85 to 95% of the Dreamcast library is locked to the Dreamcast. Because, again, it's a lot of annual sports games and ports of then current arcade games that nobody gives a fuck about today. They're not dumping Virtua Fighter 3 on Game Pass when you'd be better off playing Virtua Fighter whatever they're on, 6 or 7 or whatever. Because they're going to make more money doing that. Now, there are some exceptions. There are some fantastic games on the Dreamcast. I have got to emphasize that. Virtua On is an example. Monkey Ball or Super Monkey Ball. That's a great game. Sonic Adventure, Sonic Adventure 2. The aforementioned Power Stone. Shenmue. I don't like Shenmue, but a lot of people did. There are some legit quality titles on the Dreamcast. Just, in my opinion, not enough to justify going out of your way. Because hypothetically, realistically, you even if you find a Dreamcast, a retro video game store that carries Dreamcast software, 9 times out of 10 it's going to be the same 7 or 8 fucking 2K sports games. And a whole bunch of copies of Phantasy Star Online that, guess what? Don't even play. By the way, it doesn't even mean shit that the console was online in 1999, which, at the time was a major deal. Who cares? You can't really play it online today without fucking hacking it. So that's not even a major selling point today because you still have to hack it anyways to play NFL 2K 99 online or 2K1 online. Wouldn't you rather just play fucking NFL 2K24 or Madden, whatever the fuck they're on? It doesn't make sense, because you're gonna go online and you're gonna find a couple of bots and 3 or 4 fucking 50-year-old fat ass nerds living in their grandma's basement who never grew up, who are stuck in 1999. I don't recommend collecting for the Dreamcast. Unless you are like a diehard Sega fan, and even then, oh man. If you have to spend that kind of money to invest in something worthwhile, get a Saturn, because at least you've got some actual, like, original titles that are actually, interesting and fun. You're not going to find a lot. Typing of the Dead? God damn it, fuck off. Don't give me that shit. Typing of the Dead is awesome. No, it isn't. If you think Typing of the Dead is awesome, stick this up your nose and then shove it up your butt where it belongs. That's all I gotta say. I'm not trying to be a bitch, and I'm not trying to shit on the Dreamcast. I'm just being fucking upfront with you because nobody else has the balls to do it. And I've got the backbone to tell you the goddamn truth. The Dreamcast is over fucking rated. And I promise, I 100% promise, you're going to be hyped up for this Dreamcast game, and you're going to spend $70 to $100 on it, and you're going to spend a couple $100 on the system, pop it in, and you're going to be so goddamn disappointed, you're going to be pissed off that you paid that much money for it. I fucking promise. Unless you had a Dreamcast in '99 and have nostalgia for it, you're not, 100% not going to be impressed by what the Dreamcast has to offer. That's a goddamn fact. Because it's not that impressive. I bought a fucking Dreamcast because I love Sega, And I thought it was impressive next gen, and boy howdy was I fucking wrong. As soon as I got my hands on a PS2 and a GameCube, I was like, oh no, this is not on the same level. Don't even lump it in the same generation as them, because it ain't on the same goddamn level.